Well, hello, greetings and salutations. Welcome to Knife Chats with Tobias. So, what am I doing with a big pile of knives on the table? Well, I thought I would talk about certain styles of knife blades, and I'm going to say right in the beginning here, don't get too hung up about it. Seriously, there's no reason to. But I'm going to be talking about Sheepfoot blades, Wharncliffe blades, and Hawkbill blades, and how to tell them apart. And again, don't get really too hung up about it, because when it comes right down to it, at the end of the day, go with whatever the knife maker calls their blade. If the knife maker, especially when you're looking at a lot of the modern folders out there are modern folders that call a blade a Wharncliffe blade, and I look at it and go, there is no way in heck that is a Wharncliffe blade. But you know what? If the knife maker says that's their Wharncliffe blade, that's their Wharncliffe blade. And the same thing with the Sheepfoot blade and the Hawkbill blade. Usually the Hawkbill blade is a Hawkbill blade. But even within Hawkbill blades, there is differences between them. And let me start with the Hawkbill. Because that one is the most obvious, and we have one right here from Right Edge. And, well, there you go. That's the Hawkbill blade. Kind of straight here, big curving bottom, and then it rounds off and it has a nice sharp pointy tip here. Thing is this isn't always called a Hawkbill blade. Sometimes they'll be calling it a pruning blade, because this knife is used for pruning branches and stuff. You'll also hear it called a linoleum blade, and you'll also hear it called a carpet blade, because it's all used for various trades for cutting different things. Carpeting, linoleum, tree branches, so on and so forth. Well, that's your Hawkbill blade. That's really what it looks like. Until, of course, it looks like this on this mushroom knife. Notice this is not nearly as Hawkbilly as this one is, but they're both a Hawkbill blade, in that it is kind of straight, and then you've got the curving portion there, and you got the little tip here. This is actually a Hawkbill blade that I like much more than these big fat ones. I find these to be a tad too big in the pocket and stuff. I like the one, if this could have gone straighter, it would have been fine. And there you go. Here's my Klein tool, and that one is much more in line with what that one is. Matter of fact, this might be a little shortened here simply because of use. But all of these are known as a Hawkbill blade. And pretty much straightforward. There you go. Hawkbill blade, Hawkbill blade. Most people are not going to sit there and argue with you, but do know that not every Hawkbill blade is going to look like this. For instance, here we have the Victorinox Hunter, and it's got this little blade down here. They call it a gutting blade. Is that a Hawkbill blade, or is it a gutting blade, or is it both? Really, it's your call. If you want to call it a small Hawkbill blade, call it a Hawkbill blade. They have a similar blade on other knives, like their electrician knife, and it's called a Hawkbill blade on that. So, see what I mean? And then, what do you call this one on this mushroom knife? Is that a Hawkbill blade or what? I guess it is, and then again, maybe it isn't, because of the curvature of the blade and stuff. Again, don't get too hung up. If the manufacturer calls it a Hawkbill blade, it's a Hawkbill blade. Otherwise, just kind of go with the flow, and if you think it's a Hawkbill, say it's a Hawkbill, until somebody else says otherwise. If nothing else, you can say it's a modified Hawkbill, or it's a Hawkbill-like blade. But then in the world of karambits, the Hawkbill blade is often called a talon, and I guess that's because of the way it is shaped, the way it drops down, so it looks more like a claw. And so then, does this suddenly become a talon also? Maybe. Whatever the manufacturer calls it. If they want to call it a talon, it's a talon. If they want to call it a Hawkbill, it's a Hawkbill. No one should be jumping all over you if you get it a little bit wrong, especially if it's a knife that you're not familiar with. And sometimes that's the thing to do, is ask the person who's selling it, what do you call that blade? Is it a Hawkbill? Is it a Talon or what? And then let them call it out. This one, yeah, I think MTEX calls this a Talon, and well, I know that Mercury calls this one a Hawkbill. Let's move on to the Sheepfoot. And this is a blade that is very common in most marlin spike knives these days. Now, originally, marlin spike knives had a spear blade, but most of the modern ones have a Sheepfoot style blade. And what you have in a Sheepfoot is a blade that is kind of well, it's a straight blade. The cutting edge and the spine are both running parallel to each other. And then just before you get to the tip of the blade, the spine takes a curve and is rather blunt and drops down into the cutting edge. And that's really your typical Sheepfoot blade. But sometimes that Sheepfoot blade is not going to be two parallel lines. For instance, on this one, you have the cutting edge is going this way, and then if you notice, it gets wider from the tang as it works its way to the tip of the knife. And it's very much a straight edge here, and then it's kind of very blunt at the end here. And these are often referred to as a ram's foot blade. Of course, Camillus does not call this is made by Camillus, as you can see there. Camillus does not call this a ram's foot blade, but typically, if you don't see it named anything, people will call it a ram's foot blade, or they'll just continue to call it a sheepfoot blade. Either one is going to be fine. Camillus calls it something else, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in any case, that's typically what you see in a ram's foot blade. But here you have another Camillus here, marlin spike knife. This one here is a rope knife. And if you notice, the blade also does the same thing. It slightly gets wider, but most people will still continue to call this one a sheepfoot blade because it isn't significantly different. They're not in parallel, but the width doesn't get that dramatically different, so it's still usually just referred to as a sheepfoot blade. And next up, we have this knife here. This is from Eric from Slick Slicers, and it was made by A. Wright and Son, and it is a well, it's very much a British pattern known as a lamb's foot. We often would refer to this as a swayback because of the handle, but they refer to it as a lamb's foot because of the style of blade. And that is, again, if you notice, it is very much a sheepfoot style of blade, but it narrows. The thickness or the width of the blade narrows as it comes to the point, and then it has the angled cut off here. And this this style of blade is also known as something else in America, and it's interesting because this blade is also called the same thing. So it really depends on who's making it. But that is your typical sheepfoot or lamb's foot blade out of England. And as you can see, all of these vary a little bit, but you can see the family resemblance, and that's why they're all named after different kind of, well, sheep or lamb or ram. So see the differences, how they, the general profile of the blade. So, and that they're all considered in the, I guess, in the sheepfoot family, but they're just a different, slightly different style of blade. Now, as I mentioned, they're also called something a little bit different sometime, especially this one. And this one, because of the way this blade is cut here, notice how most of them kind of round off here, how it's rounded here. This one has a much more distinct angle at the cut. And this is the type of cut that you will usually see on a blade known as a coping blade. And I think that has to do with who is doing the work with it. So with the lamb's foot blade, well, these are usually used in rope work and everything else, so they're used around water and stuff. But the coping blade is something that is used more often by carpenters. You notice, once again, in this case, it's very much straight. It's parallel both ends. But then notice the cut of the angle going on with the coping blade. See how the cut happens? It's a much more distinct cut, as you see on this blade, or also as you see on the another blade here on this case seahorse. All of these are styles of coping blades, but in the case of if it's a British swayback knife, it's going to be called a lamb's foot blade. That's just the way it is. Do you want to call these a lamb's foot blade? You could, but most people would say, no, that's a coping blade. And that's what brings me back to this blade here, because while this is definitely, most people will look at that and say it's a ram's foot blade, not according to Camillus. This also is a coping blade. That's what they referred to it as. So, do you think of that as a coping blade? Probably not, but Camillus calls it that, so you will see it often referred to as a coping blade because that's what Camillus called it. Hey, and if Camillus called it a coping blade, it's a coping blade. And that brings us to this blade here, which is referred to, the knife is referred to as a half hawk, but it's basically a copy of the old case loom fixer. And the blade on the loom fixer was known as a, I believe they also called it a coping blade, but most people these days look at it and say it's a ram's foot blade because of the shape of the blade. And notice it has a much more distinct look of a sheepfoot blade than this one does. This one has that very much bullish, almost straight up and down. This one has a much better curve going on to it. But Rough Rider called it a half hawk, but really it's a ram's foot blade. So you may see the ram's foot blade occasionally called a half hawk, because if that's the first knife that a person picked up and they saw that blade on it, then they're going to say, okay, that's a half hawk blade. So don't pick on them because of it. It's just the fact of life. And the same thing here. If this is the first blade a person saw and they bought it from Camillus and Camillus called it a coping blade, then it's a coping blade. And they think of other coping blades that way. They're all, it's just, again, just don't get too hung up on what the blade is called. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And so that brings me back here to this knife by Victorinox. This is their gardener's knife. It's got a couple blades on it. The one blade that is interesting is right here. Actually, the other blade's much more interesting. But this blade is obviously a sheepfoot blade. I mean, it's parallel on the top to the cutting edge here. Has the curve. Looks very much like your typical sheepfoot blade. Who would argue that point? It's definitely a sheepfoot. However, for some reason now, and by the way, this was called a sheepfoot blade when I purchased it. Victorinox was listing it as a sheepfoot blade. However, now they're calling it a Wharncliffe blade. Kind of hard to say that is a Wharncliffe blade because, well, there's a Wharncliffe blade. You notice the curve and the way it drops. The curve starts all the way back at the tang and just is a slow curve all the way down into a point, and it's got a much more distinct point on it than what you see on a sheepfoot blade. Notice the difference in the points and the width of the blade and everything else. The only thing that these two blades have in common is they both have a straight cutting edge. There's no curve in the cutting edge. But other than that, it's hard to say that this is the same style of blade as this, especially when we just saw blades like this that are called a sheepfoot blade. Now, here's another Wharncliffe blade, and you'll see once again, while it doesn't start all the way back at the tang, the curve starts significantly far back, about 2/3 the way back on the blade, and then it drops down into a straight cutting edge. And that's your typical style of Wharncliffe blade. However, if Victorinox is going to call this their Wharncliffe blade, then it's going to be the Victorinox Wharncliffe blade. So you may see that happen occasionally, that a knife manufacturer, just like the coping blade back here, will call a blade that you would see elsewhere and say, no, that's a Sheepfoot blade. I don't care what they're calling it. Well, if you're trying to find it, it's going to be called a Wharncliffe blade at the moment by Victorinox. This other blade is known as a grafting blade, a grafting and budding blade, and it's really kind of interesting. And it's used for grafting and budding trees. And talk about a funky blade. You thought the cotton sampler was weird? Look at that blade. In any case, let's see, what have I not covered? I talked about the Wharncliffe blade to some degree, and one of the things about Wharncliffe blades these days, you are going to see all varieties of blades called a Wharncliffe blade today, because apparently Wharncliffe blades are very popular, and so just about especially among modern knife makers, they call anything that could even be remotely confused with a Wharncliffe blade a Wharncliffe blade, or a modified Wharncliffe blade. And some of them, I look at them and shake my head. But the thing is it really comes down to, you could say, all right, that's Artisan's Wharncliffe blade, or that's CRKT's Wharncliffe blade, or something like that. It may not be the traditional Wharncliffe blade, but it is a Wharncliffe blade because the manufacturer has said so. We could sit there and argue forever about those kind of things. And I guess that's really the end point here that I'm trying to get to, is don't get too hung up on what the blade is called. Different people are going to call different blades different things. I tend to look at the more traditional knives a lot, so when I see this, it's like, yep, that's a Sheepfoot blade. When I see this, yeah, that's a Wharncliffe blade. You know, it might be different styles of Wharncliffe blades, but it's a Wharncliffe blade. And when I see something like this, yeah, that's a Hawkbill. And you saw that there's a variety of different blades out there that have a variety of different names that can be falling into the Sheepfoot, the Wharncliffe, and the Hawkbill. So I guess that's where I'm going to leave it at right now. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I probably did not answer anyone's question, but I have been asked on numerous occasions, well, what is a Sheepfoot blade? What is a Hawkbill? And so on and so forth. So that's why I'm rambling on about these blades. And I'm going to try and do the same thing with other ones. I guess the best way to do it is to show examples of the different blades, and then you can decide what's a Sheepfoot, what's a Hawkbill, or what is a ram's foot or a lamb's foot, or what's a Wharncliffe blade. Good luck with the Wharncliffe, especially these days. All right, talk to you again soon. Sure hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to leave a comment and give it that big old thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, and go out there and tell your friends there's another episode just around the corner. Thanks a lot for visiting. Really appreciate you being here. Talk to you again soon.